Have you ever watched a moment unfold, so raw and real, that it felt like a mirror reflecting unspoken truths about power and respect? The House Oversight Committee hearing on May 16, 2024, was one such moment. It was supposed to be a routine discussion about Attorney General Merrick Garland, but it detonated into a fiery exchange between Representatives Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jasmine Crockett, exposing the fault lines of identity, decorum, and the deeply ingrained double standards that permeate not just politics, but everyday life. What followed wasn't just a political squabble. It was a stark lesson in how we navigate disrespect and the courage it takes to challenge the unwritten rules. It was supposed to be a routine hearing until Marjorie Taylor Greene insulted Jasmine Crockett to her face. What followed wasn't just a clapback. It was a masterclass in composure, power, and calling out double standards. You could hear it in the way the air shifted. 1 second, the House Oversight Committee was trudging through another long-winded debate, and the next, everything stopped. No gavel, no warning, just words, sharp, pointed, and cutting straight through the room. Please tell me what that has to do with Merrick Garland. Do you know what we're here for? The voice came from Representative Jasmine Crockett, eyes locked, tone steady. She wasn't yelling, but you could feel in your chest. Across the table sat Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, never one to bite her tongue. She leaned in slightly, her face calm but cold. "I think your fake eyelashes are messing up what you're reading," Greene shot back. And just like that, it went from political posturing to personal attack. You could practically see the breath catch in the lungs of every person on that committee floor. Even those who weren't watching the exchange were now glued in. No one was sure what would happen next, but everyone knew something had changed. This wasn't about policy anymore. It wasn't even about Merrick Garland or audio recordings. It was about two women who had had enough of each other, of the games, of the lines being crossed, and the silence that followed. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't waste a second. "That is absolutely unacceptable. How dare you attack the physical appearance of another person?" She wasn't speaking softly. She was speaking for every woman who'd ever been dismissed with a sneer, every professional who had to sit through backhanded compliments dressed up as jokes. But the chair, Representative James Comer, didn't budge. He didn't strike the comment from the record. He didn't call a recess. He let it hang there, Greene's insult like dirty laundry in public. That's when Jasmine leaned forward again. If someone on this committee then starts talking about somebody's bleach blonde, bad-built, butch body, she said, voice tight but controlled, that would not be engaging in personalities, correct? No shouting, no swearing, just fire wrapped in logic. Her tone didn't waver, but you could see her eyes narrow ever so slightly, like someone measuring the distance between what she wanted to say and what the rules would allow. And suddenly, this wasn't just a disagreement. This was a battle. People often talk about politics like it's a chessboard, strategy, moves, outcomes. But this felt more like a street corner standoff. Every word had weight. Every silence had purpose. The women weren't just defending their sides. They were defending their dignity. Some smirked. Others shifted in their chairs, but no one laughed because beneath the sting of the words was something more dangerous: recognition. Everyone in that room knew what was happening. Two women from two very different Americas clashing, not just over politics, but power, identity, and space. And no matter how it ended, something had already been said that couldn't be unsaid. But what most people didn't see was what led to that moment and how long it had been building. Long before the clash in that committee room, their stories were already on a collision course. Jasmine Crockett didn't grow up with connections. She wasn't someone people handed things to. She was raised in St. Louis, Missouri, the kind of place where your voice had to be loud enough to reach beyond your zip code if you ever wanted to be heard. Her mother was a teacher. Her father was a preacher. Structure and grit were baked into her bones. She became a civil rights attorney before stepping into politics, not because it looked good on a resume, but because she saw how the system treated people who looked like her. Her cases weren't flashy. They were real: evictions, police misconduct, everyday folks up against odds they didn't choose. By the time she landed in the Texas House, Jasmine wasn't there to play nice. She was direct. She had that courtroom sharpness that didn't care if you were offended, only that the truth got out. And when she was elected to Congress in 2022, a lot of people didn't know what to make of her. But anyone who underestimated her learned fast. She wasn't the type to sit quiet while nonsense flew across the table. Marjorie Greene, on the other hand, came from a very different world. Raised in Milledgeville, Georgia, Greene inherited her father's construction company and ran it before turning to politics. She built her base by being loud, louder than most, and saying what others were too afraid to. She didn't just lean into controversy. She camped there. Her district loved her for it. She went viral often. She wore confrontation like armor. And when she got to Washington, she didn't try to blend in. She made headlines with conspiracy theories and confrontations. She picked fights with fellow lawmakers in the halls. She was kicked off committees. She called it censorship. Others called it chaos. Two women, two Americas, and yet they ended up seated just feet apart, forced to listen to each other while barely concealing what they really thought. They'd crossed paths before, a side-eye here, a quiet jab there, but something had been building. You could feel it in their interviews, in the way their names were passed around cable news, social media clips circulating like wildfire. People didn't just follow them. They picked sides. One represented tradition twisted into outrage. The other represented disruption with purpose. Still, inside those walls, they had to abide by the same rules. And rules only matter when someone's willing to enforce them. That's the thing about Congress. It looks organized on paper. Procedures, committees, motions, but behind closed doors, it's a mess of personalities, egos, alliances, and unspoken rules. The power isn't just in what you say, it's in what people let you get away with. For months, Greene had been testing those limits, pushing boundaries, towing the line between criticism and personal insult. And for just as long, Crockett had been watching. When Greene mentioned Judge Merchant's daughter, dragging someone's family into a debate that had nothing to do with them, it wasn't a rookie mistake. It was a tactic of provocation. Crockett knew it. That's why she interrupted, not out of anger, but out of refusal. She wasn't going to sit silent while the floor was turned into a circus. But then came the eyelash comment. People will say it's just words, that Greene was just being green, but it wasn't harmless. It was calculated. It was meant to humiliate, to reduce a professional black woman to makeup and vanity, to make her small. And Crockett saw it for exactly what it was. You could tell by the way she didn't yell. She didn't roll her eyes, or throw papers, or walk out. She responded the way someone does when they've been insulted before, when they know exactly how to twist that blade back and still keep it legal. She turned the insult into a mirror. That line about the bleach blonde, bad-built, butch body wasn't meant to escalate. It was meant to expose. Because if Greene's comment didn't break the rules, then neither would that. And in that moment, the rules looked a little different. Not because they changed, but because Crockett made everyone in that room look at how they were being applied and to whom. But what really shook people came next. Not just what happened inside that room, but how the world reacted once the doors opened. May 16th, 2024 wasn't supposed to be explosive. The agenda was clear. The House Oversight Committee was there to discuss whether Attorney General Merrick Garland should be held in contempt of Congress. The reason? He hadn't handed over audio of President Biden's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur. Dry stuff, procedural, legal, dense, the kind of meeting where most people zone out unless they're the ones doing the talking. But that's the thing about high-pressure rooms full of people who already can't stand each other. It doesn't take much for the heat to rise. From the start, you could sense the tension. Members were already side-eyeing each other, tapping pens too hard, shifting in their chairs too often. What should have been a discussion about evidence and subpoenas quickly started to feel like a battlefield made of microphones and rules. It didn't help that Marjorie Greene was already veering off track. She wasn't talking about Garland, not really. She brought up Judge Juan Merchan's daughter, someone who had nothing to do with the topic at hand, suggesting she was involved with Democrats on the committee. It was messy, indirect, but pointed. That's when Jasmine Crockett broke her silence. She didn't wait for her turn or raise her hand. She leaned forward and cut in with a tone that wasn't loud, but left no room for interruption. Please tell me what that has to do with Merrick Garland. Do you know what we're here for? It was one of those questions that sounds innocent, but lands like a punch. Not because of what it said, but what it implied. You're out of line. You know it, and I'm not letting it slide. Some heads turned, some looked away. People weren't sure if this was the start of a typical squabble or something different. Then Greene leaned back slightly, smiled faintly, and fired back. I think your fake eyelashes are messing up what you're reading. Time stopped. There are moments in politics where everything slows and people decide in real time whether to pretend they didn't hear what they just heard. This wasn't one of those times. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez reacted fast. She didn't ask for decorum. She demanded it. Her voice shot across the room as she called the insult unacceptable and requested it be stricken from the record. She was visibly angry, not performative, but protective. You could feel it. And yet, Chair James Comer didn't see a problem. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't take a break. He just ruled that Greene's remark didn't break the rules. That's when everything shifted, because if that didn't break the rules, then what did? Crockett took that moment and turned it into a scalpel. She didn't scream. She didn't storm out. She asked a question, carefully, purposefully, just to better understand your ruling. If someone on this committee then starts talking about somebody's bleach blonde, bad bill, butch body, that would, 1, not be engaging in personalities, correct? 2, it was sharp, deliberate, and surgical. She wasn't just calling out Greene. She was calling out the double standard. The one that lets some women be loud and abrasive and reckless and still be protected, while others, especially black women, are expected to stay calm, measured, and quiet no matter what's thrown their way. The room didn't explode, it froze. Not because of what she said, but because of what it revealed. Some tried to laugh it off, others stayed quiet, but everyone in that room understood what just happened. Crockett didn't break the rules, she exposed them. And from that point forward, the hearing never really got back on track. They went through the motions. They debated the resolution. Eventually, they voted to recommend holding Garland in contempt. But no one was paying attention to that anymore. All eyes were on the exchange, the moment the hearing turned human. But outside those walls, the reactions came fast and louder than anyone inside that room could have predicted. The clips hit the internet before the hearing even ended. By the time the committee broke for recess, the phrase fake eyelashes was already trending on every major platform. But it wasn't just about the insult. People weren't watching for sound bites. They were watching Jasmine Crockett's face. Not angry, not surprised, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from knowing you're being targeted and still having to explain why it matters. Some viewers applauded her calm. Others clapped back online for her bad-built butch body comment, claiming she stooped to Greene's level. But those who watched closely knew better. That wasn't a dig. It was a challenge, a line drawn to expose how easily decorum could be twisted depending on who was speaking. Behind closed doors, it was even messy, eh? Multiple committee members approached Crockett during the break, some to offer support, a few quietly to tell her they were glad she said what they couldn't. One staffer who didn't want her name on record later told a journalist. She said what a lot of us were thinking but never had the guts to say out loud. Still, Crockett wasn't celebrating. She returned to her office, dropped her folders on the desk, and exhaled without a word. Her team was quiet too, not out of discomfort but out of recognition. These moments didn't need a speech, they needed space. Eventually, one of her aides asked gently, "Do you want to say something to the press?" Jasmine didn't look up right away. She just said, "If I say something, I want it to be for the girls who look like me, not for her." So she waited. Later that evening, in a controlled interview with a local outlet back in Texas, she finally spoke. What happened today is what happens every day in boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, just usually not on camera, she said. The minute you challenge someone who's used to walking over people, they turn it personal. And then when you stand up for yourself, somehow you're the problem. Her words weren't theatrical. They didn't need to be. They just told the truth. Meanwhile, Greene doubled down. She went on conservative talk shows that night, framing the exchange as another example of Democrats being hypersensitive. She said Crockett couldn't take a joke and accused her of trying to play the victim card. But her tone lacked bite. It wasn't the usual firebrand delivery. Even she seemed slightly off-center, maybe not rattled, but poked. People started asking real questions. Why is it okay for a sitting member of Congress to insult someone's appearance in the middle of a formal hearing? Why do the rules protect some and punish others for reacting? And what message does it send when the insult goes unpunished? But the response is dissected like a science experiment. That week, the committee's transcript was reviewed by outside legal experts. Not for disciplinary action, nothing like that, but for clarity. There was pressure now from civil rights groups, legal scholars, even members of the public, asking how far decorum could stretch before it became protection for bigotry. One professor from Howard University put it best. This isn't just about Congress. It's about every workplace where black women are expected to keep their cool while someone else gets away with cutting them down. That moment between Crockett and Greene, raw, public, sharp, had turned into a kind of cultural mirror. It reflected the cracks so many people walk around every day pretending not to see. People weren't debating policies anymore. They were debating dignity. Still, amid the noise, Crockett stayed focused. She didn't go on a press tour. She didn't spend days tweeting zingers. She went back to the floor and did her job. But anyone watching her that week could tell something had shifted. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every person in every room who's had to sit there, smile, and pretend they weren't just insulted. But this wasn't the end, because what happened inside that room started spreading far beyond Capitol Hill. By the weekend, what started as a tense exchange in a Capitol Hill committee room had become a full-blown national debate, not just about politics, but about identity, about whose voice gets heard and whose pain gets minimized. Cable news panels couldn't stop looping the same 30 seconds. Radio hosts dissected every syllable like it was a football play. People argued in group chats, in barbershops, at church potlucks, not just about who was right, but what the whole thing meant. Because this wasn't just about Crockett and Greene anymore. It had struck a nerve much deeper. In cities like Toledo, Ohio, and Bakersfield, California, mothers were having hard conversations with their daughters about how to handle disrespect in public without being labeled angry or difficult. In places like Shreveport, Louisiana, and Mesa, Arizona, people who'd never watched a congressional hearing before were replaying the video and texting friends. You see this mess? And in that strange way politics sometimes reflects life, the whole country found itself standing in that committee room, watching two women fight to be seen on their own terms. To understand why it hits so hard, you have to understand the weight carried into that room by both women. For Greene, it's the performance, the belief that her shock tactics win loyalty, that volume equals strength, that being outrageous makes her unshakable. But for Crockett, her power comes from precision. Every word is measured. Every silence has a reason. She doesn't speak just to be heard. She speaks because not speaking comes at a cost she's all too familiar with. In that moment, they weren't just debating. They were embodying two realities. One where audacity is protected, and another where composure is demanded even in the face of disrespect. And for millions of women watching, it was painfully familiar. They saw Crockett forced to walk that tightrope. Say something strong, but not too strong. Push back, but not too hard. Look composed even when someone's coming for your dignity. The emotional weight of that balancing act is one that never makes it into transcripts, but it's real. And the irony? When Crockett finally pushed back with her own sharp comment, she wasn't celebrated for her wit. She was scolded, as if defending yourself with the same sharpness used against you somehow made you the problem. That's the trap. Respectability politics doesn't care who started the fight. It only cares how you reacted. And for black women, the rules are always different. Meanwhile, the committee itself tried to move on like nothing happened. Resolutions were still being filed, statements were still being drafted, but behind every closed-door meeting, there were whispers. Some staffers privately admitted they'd never seen such a blatant double standard play out so openly. Others were already trying to frame it as just a misunderstanding. But Crockett didn't shrink. In the days following, she sat for interviews, not to drag Greene, but to shine a light on the silence. The way the rules shifted when she spoke, the way professionalism was used against her, and mockery was given a pass. She didn't ask for pity. She asked for awareness. And that's what made it land. Because if you strip away the titles, the microphones, and the marble columns, what happened that day wasn't rare. It was common. That's why it hit so many people so hard. They recognized it not from the news, but from their own lives, from the teacher who was told she was too loud in meetings, from the attorney who got called intimidating when she presented her case clearly, from the cashier who was mocked for her hair by a manager with a forced smile. This wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural reveal. And even those who tried to dismiss it couldn't ignore it. Because when something is that raw, that honest, it has a way of cutting through all the noise. But it wasn't just people online reacting. The ripple moved into real-world spaces, places where policy meets public opinion, and the tension hit home in a whole new way. By Monday morning, the headlines had a life of their own. Crockett versus Greene, fireworks on the Hill, fake eyelashes, and butch bodies. Where's the line? The story was everywhere, but the way it was being told depended on where you looked. Some conservative outlets painted Greene as the victim of a double standard, accusing Democrats of being hypersensitive and woke to a fault. They looped her smirk during the exchange, spun it as confidence, as if the insult was just a playful jab. They barely mentioned the context, the disrespect, the deflection, or the real question Crockett was trying to ask. On the other side, progressive voices rallied around Crockett. They framed her as the woman who finally said what needed to be said, the one who didn't just let it slide. Memes popped up, t-shirts were already being printed with her most cutting line. People were calling into radio shows just to say how proud they were that someone finally stood their ground. But what was most interesting wasn't what happened in the media. It was what happened in people's homes, their workplaces, their churches. In Santa Fe, New Mexico, a community group of women educators discussed the exchange during their Saturday breakfast meeting. Many of them didn't know much about Crockett before that week, but they knew what it felt like to sit through meetings where their ideas were dismissed and their appearance was picked apart. In Spokane, Washington, a retired veteran told his daughter over lunch that it reminded him of his time in command, where women always had to prove twice as much for half the respect. In Pensacola, Florida, a group of young voters sat around folding chairs in someone's backyard, watching the video on repeat. A few of them admitted they didn't usually follow politics, but something about this felt real, like it wasn't rehearsed. That's what made the moment stick. It didn't feel like strategy, it felt like life. Even outside political circles, the impact was felt. On morning shows, hosts who rarely touched on policy were asking their viewers, was this about Garland? Or was this about something deeper? Because by now, everyone knew it wasn't just about Merrick Garland. What had started as a routine discussion about government procedure became a flashpoint about respect, power, and accountability. It peeled back the curtain on what happens when the rules of professionalism are applied unevenly, when some voices are allowed to poke and prod while others are policed and punished for pushing back. Some lawmakers try to get ahead of the backlash by calling for restraint and civility, but it rang hollow, especially since so many of them stayed silent when the first insult was thrown. Civility, it seemed, only mattered once someone like Jasmine Crockett decided not to shrink back. In Texas, Crockett kept getting stopped by people on the street, older women, students, even a few young fathers. "I saw you," one woman said quietly while holding Crockett's hand. "I've been in that room before. Not the Capitol, but you know that room." She didn't know. That's what made it heavy. It wasn't pride. It wasn't ego. It was something else. The weight of having to represent something bigger than yourself, even when you didn't ask for it. And for Greene, the response was less unified. Her base remained loyal, but beyond that bubble, there were cracks. Some Republican strategists quietly voiced concern that her antics were no longer landing, that what once came across as bold was now reading as mean, that even among moderate conservatives, people were starting to question whether her style was a distraction from real work. The hearing was no longer about Garland. It had become a mirror, showing people what Congress really looks like when the cameras are rolling and the masks drop. It wasn't about left versus right anymore. It was about power, how it's used, how it's weaponized, and who's expected to keep smiling while it happens. But if anything good came from it, it was what people chose to do next, how they carried the conversation forward in the quiet places where real change often starts. In the days that followed, as the headlines shifted and social media moved on to the next controversy, something lingered. People weren't just remembering what was said, They were remembering how it felt. Jasmine Crockett didn't become a hero overnight, and she didn't try to. She stayed grounded, returning to the work that brought her to Congress in the first place. But for those who watched the hearing unfold in real time, her restraint, her clarity, and her refusal to be talked down stayed with them in a way that few political moments do. And here's why. Most people don't live on Capitol Hill. They don't argue over committee rules or chase subpoenas across marble floors. But they do sit in conference rooms where someone takes a jab at their appearance and expects them to laugh it off. They do sit across from colleagues or managers who hide disrespect behind jokes. And they know what it means to choose between speaking up and being labeled difficult, or staying silent and letting the moment define them. What Crockett did was make that decision in front of cameras, in a space where the stakes were national, and she didn't flinch. She didn't yell. She didn't throw the insult back with the same cruelty. She flipped the lens, held it up to the room, and let everyone sit in it. She asked a question, and that question, about whether the same behavior would be allowed if it came from someone who looked like her, didn't need an answer. It already revealed the truth. That's why her words echoed, because they spoke for more than just herself. And a lesson? It's not just about calling out hypocrisy. It's about how we respond to disrespect when it's baked into the culture, when it hides behind rules, when people look the other way and pretend it didn't happen. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't clap back louder. It's forcing the room to reckon with itself. Marjorie Greene may have gotten the attention that day, but Crockett earned the respect. And as the noise faded, the impact stayed, not in hashtags or headlines, but in conversations. A high school debate team in Fresno, California, held a mock hearing using the real transcripts. They didn't debate policy. They debated tone, language, equity. One student stood up at the end and said, "I didn't know Congress talked like this. I thought they were supposed to be better than us." In a hair salon in Jackson, Mississippi, two sisters watched the clip on a loop, not because they needed to, but because it reminded them of work of the manager who talked down to them in staff meetings of how long it took them to speak up. Even in places far from the political spotlight, diners, break rooms, family kitchens, people were using that hearing as a reference point, a story they could point to, a moment they could dissect. Because when something feels that familiar, it becomes more than a news story. It becomes a blueprint. What Crockett did wasn't about winning an argument. It was about refusing to let disrespect become the norm. And that's the bigger message here. It's not about who you vote for. It's about what you tolerate. It's about recognizing that silence, even when polite, can let the wrong people define the space. And sometimes it takes one person asking the right question, calmly, firmly, fearlessly, to shake the room awake. So here's the takeaway. Watch who gets protected. Watch who gets corrected. And most importantly, watch what happens when someone refuses to shrink to fit a space they've earned the right to stand in. Because the truth is, this country doesn't change through explosions. It changes through moments like this. Moments where someone says, "That's enough," and everyone finally hears it. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, share it, talk about it, and subscribe for more honest stories like this, where truth meets voice and voice refuses to be ignored. The lesson here isn't just about politics. It's about humanity. It's about recognizing that moments like these don't just happen on the floor of Congress. They happen in boardrooms, classrooms, coffee shops, anywhere power and respect collide. It's about understanding that silence isn't always golden. Sometimes silence is complicity, and sometimes it takes one person to stand up and say enough. So what can we do? We can start by paying attention to how we treat each other, how we allow others to treat us, and how we allow those in power to treat those without. We can challenge double standards when we see them, even when it's uncomfortable. We can support those who speak up, even when their voices tremble. And we can remember that change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one moment, one conversation, one decision to stand up at a time. Jasmine Crockett didn't change the world that day, but she did change the conversation. And in a world where words have the power to build or destroy, that's a start.